Jó napot kívánok! Nagyon sok szeretettel köszöntöm Önöket, akik elfogadták meghívásunkat. Beszélgetésünk, kerekasztal-beszélgetésünk címe Szabadság, Harcosok, válasza, kommunizmusra, és sikerült megnyernünk Patrick Egent, egy Magyarországon élő külpolitikai elemzőt, hogy ezt a beszélgetést vezesse. Önök nagyon jól fognak járni, mert egy nagyon izgalmas beszélgetésre készülhetünk, azon egyszerű oknál fogva, hogy most mondok néhány nevet, és meg kellene találnunk a közös nevezőt. Hannah Arendt, Thomas Mann, George Orwell, John O'Sullivan, Joshua Muravcsik. A commentary. Ez a folyóirat köti össze őket, mindegyikük ebben a folyóiratban publikált, és ez az a folyóirat, amely nagyban hozzájárult ahhoz, hogy azt a átható unalmat, azt a defenzívát, amit a 70-es években, akik ebben a térségben éltek, megéltek, amelynek azt volt az egyik vezérlő gondolata, hogy ez a kommunista világ, ez a bipoláris világ, ez már addig lesz, ameddig világ a világ. Azt az erőfeszítést, azt az intellektuális erőfeszítést például a kommenteri köré gyűlő neokonzervatív szerzők törték meg, és adtak egy egészen új üzenetet. Ha úgy tetszik, megteremtették a győzelem nyelvét, ők voltak a szabadság harcosok, és azt hiszem nagyon sokkal tartozunk nekik, és nagyon örülünk, hogy két szerzője ennek a nagyon magas színvonalú folyóiratnak itt van Budapesten, elfogadta a meghívásunkat. Most pedig átadom a szót Patrick Egannek.
Köszönöm szépen, Gábor. Thank you very much, Gábor. It's terrific to be here with you this afternoon and great to see such a nice number of people turning out for this conversation on a Monday afternoon. I want to thank, first of all, the House of Terror Museum and its director, Maria Schmidt, for hosting us, inviting us to this, putting together this event this afternoon. The House of Terror has played an extremely important role over the last decade here in Budapest in the public discourse, and it's terrific to be a part of its programs, not only in the museum itself, but in the conferences and events hosted here throughout the year. It's great to be a part of this. I have to confess, I've been looking forward to this for weeks. The idea that I get to share the table here with Joshua Muravchik and John O'Sullivan, I've been waiting like a little kid before Christmas to get to this evening. That I could ask all kinds of questions about the Cold War and their insights. Let me begin by introducing our two guests. Joshua Muravchik, originally from New York City, began his involvement in politics very early on. He's very much steeped in socialist causes from his youth. He confesses to participating in socialist demonstrations when he was a very young man. He served on the campaign of the legendary United States Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, a Democrat, and also advised Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Today, however, Mr. Muravchik is regarded as one of the preeminent figures of the neoconservative movement in the United States, the neoconservative cabal, as he referred to it in an article in Commentary some years back. And we're going to get to all of that during our conversation. He took his PhD in international relations from Georgetown University, has served on the committee of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights from 85 to 97. He's been a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. From 2012 to 2013, he was a fellow at the George W. Bush Institute. He's a member of the International Advisory Board of the House of Fates, known here as the Háza in Budapest. He is a regular contributor to many different papers, periodicals, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, New Republic, Weekly Standard, and of course, Commentary. The Public Foundation for the Research of East and Central European History and Society, one of our hosts this evening, has just published the Hungarian edition of his Heaven on Earth, The History of Socialism. I have it on my Kindle. It's a great book, and it's available in Hungarian, and you can buy it after the event at a discount, I believe, and I believe Mr. Muravchik will be available to dedicate the book also for those of you who would like to purchase a copy. Next year, the foundation will also publish a collection of his essays from Commentary, edited by Marton Békés. Also joining us this evening, John O'Sullivan, an old friend and great supporter of Hungary, and also no stranger to politics. After graduating the University of London, he stood for a seat in Parliament for the Conservative Party in the Gateswood West District. He was from 1972 to 1979 parliamentary correspondent of the Daily Telegraph and co-editor of the London Times. He was founder and co-chair of the New Atlantic Initiative at the American Enterprise Institute, and also one of the founding fathers of the National Review, also a very, very influential periodical in the conservative movement in the United States. 1986 to 1988, he was an advisor to the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. More recently, he has served as editor-in-chief of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty in Prague, a foreign correspondent still to this day for National Interest, and an editor-in-chief formerly of the United Press International. Today, he is a resident of Budapest. And I want to mention the book, which is another one of my favorites, The President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister, which we will get to later in the conversation. It's also available in Hungarian. It was translated and published in 2006. But more recently, he is now a resident in Budapest and director of the Danube Institute. If that were not enough, we also have joining us through an excerpt from a video interview, Norman Podhoretz. We will turn to that video in just a few minutes. Norman Podhoretz is perhaps known as the long-serving editor-in-chief, beginning back in 1960, I believe, of Commentary magazine, during which period the journal started as publication of the American Jewish community from the 1960s, but under Norman Podhoretz's direction really took it to a preeminent forum for discussion of conservative issues and fiercely defended the interests of the United States and the values of the American-led free world. He is today still considered one of the founders of the neoconservative movement and the neoconservative think tank, the Project for the New American Century. In 2004, was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by George W. Bush. I could go on and on and on. One of the things you may not know about Mr. Podhoretz is he writes excellent film reviews, so you should look those up online. But we'll turn to that video in just a moment. I would like to begin the discussion this evening with the Berlin Wall. Yesterday was the 25th anniversary of the opening of the wall. Eastern Berliners fleeing to the west through the open gates and jumping on top of the wall. Where were you when it happened? And did we really know what had happened? What were your thoughts at the time? Do we know the significance of this event? And let's begin with you, if we could, Joshua.
Well, I'm trying to remember where I was, but I think my best recollection is I was in my garden and working amidst my tomatoes and other vegetables, and I received a telephone call from the Washington Times. And of course, the fall of the wall didn't happen in a vacuum. The crumbling of communism in Eastern and Central Europe had been proceeding progressively throughout that year, and the fall of the wall was a kind of capstone on those events, and the journalist called me, and he or she, I don't remember whether it was a man or woman who called me, and said, well, we're trying to get reactions from people, and also people who have been Cold Warriors, who've been very involved in the Cold War, as to what you plan to do next. And I remember saying, well, I guess I'm going to devote the rest of my life to the study of jazz music, because the whole meaning of everything I have done is concern the battle between democracy and communism, and it's over now.
John, what about you? Did you
Yes.
fully appreciate at the time when it happened?
Well, first of all, I will not reveal right away exactly where I was when the Berlin Wall fell, because it's a slightly embarrassing thing for a journalist to have to admit. It was very far away from Berlin. But the reason for that was this. Throughout that year, the communism had begun to crumble. Now, on inauguration night in 1989, the National Review, which I then edited, gave a party, and one of the people there was the Soviet ambassador. And I presented him with the next issue, which had a copy of Lenin, a photograph of Lenin, which a hand had smashed the glass over the photograph, and it was entitled "The Coming Crack-Up of Communism," and it was written by Radek Sikorski, then our chief foreign correspondent, later on, of course, a distinguished Polish foreign minister. And I gave it to the Soviet ambassador, who said at the dinner, yes, well, there's something in what you're saying. After all, these independent countries in Europe are free to make their own decisions. Who knows what they will do? And Jean Kirkpatrick, who was there, leaned forward and said, "Are you saying that these countries could leave the Warsaw Pact?" And he said, "Well, it's not up to me. I'm the Soviet ambassador. It's up to these countries." And at that point, Bill Safire from the New York Times took a pad out of his pocket and a pencil out and started writing the story that he was subsequently going to use. So in a way, we sensed something massive was happening, but it was still in a subterranean way. It was in Hungary, of course, that the process of unraveling started seriously with the picnic, the opening of the border, which the Germans went through, the unsettling effect, undermining effect that this had on other communist countries, and throughout the summer and the fall, communist regimes looked weaker and weaker and began to crumble. Of course, in Poland, there was already a move towards a democratic government that was non-communist. So I was very, very busy that year, editing a magazine in which this was a dominant concern, and continually trying to produce the best accounts and trying to catch up with events because they constantly outran us. So by the time that November came around, I was exhausted and thought I needed a holiday. And where was I when the Berlin Wall fell? Well, I'd just taken a long plane journey and landed on the Isle of Grenada, which had been the big news story 6 years before. And they gave me, when I arrived at my hotel, they gave me a cocktail with a little parasol in it. I turned on the radio. I had the BBC World Service in my room, and I heard this amazing account of what was happening in Berlin, the crowds flooding through. And I thought to myself, well, I suppose I might get on the next plane back. But there doesn't seem much point, because that big story is the climax of these events. It wasn't the end of them. We still had events in Romania to come. But nonetheless, it was the climax, and we knew something big had happened. So I'm afraid I just ordered another cocktail. But nonetheless, it was an event which everybody who heard it at the time, wherever they were, knew was a great historic moment.
And so, as you both rightly point out, it was people had the sense that there was something large going on already, and in no small part because the pan-European picnic had happened here already in Hungary. The Iron Curtain had already been cut open here in Hungary. And yet there was a time before that, back to the 1950s and the 1960s, where people were not necessarily so sure that it would end up like that. And with that, I think it'd be a good moment to turn to the video, the first excerpt from the interview with Norman Podhoretz.
We were an evil force at home and an evil force in the world at large. That was the sum and substance of the New Left's Weltanschauung in those days. It was difficult to begin with. I used to compare it to the old cowboy movies in which the cavalry being attacked by a large band of Indians, and they run from one rock to another to give the impression that there were more than 7 of them. That's what we, that's what we, who came to be called neoconservatives, were like in this respect, in this context. Speaking for myself, I mean, I was driven out of the left by the anti-Americanism, which I simply could not stomach. I mean, even at my most fervent leftist period, I was not anti-American, but I just couldn't bear it, and it drove me into a reconsideration of everything else that, you know, surrounded that ethos. And what it took eventually, it was not an overnight revelation like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, but it was a period of reflection over a number of years, not just for me, but for almost all the people who undertook the same intellectual political journey. It took a realization, sounds quite banal now, but a realization that this country was not only not evil, but represented something both very good, very precious, and worth defending, worth dying for, on the one side. And on the other side, it took the conviction, the realization that came a little more easily to me, that communism was an evil comparable both in moral terms and in strategic terms to Nazism, and that just as we had undertaken to stop the spread of keep Nazism from conquering, so we had undertaken a comparable and analogous responsibility in 1947 to stop the communist advance, as mainly in those days embodied in the military power of the Soviet Union, military and ideological. Now, those twin realizations, which were in those days, I would say, shocking ideas, became the basis for everything else that we began to do and continued to do for about 10 years in writing and speaking about about the international situation, foreign affairs, the Cold War.
So there was a time when the outcome was not quite so sure, quite so certain. If we wind the clock back to earlier years of the Cold War, back to the 1950s and into the 60s, we have the Sputnik effect, the Cuban Missile Crisis, questions about the very possible real capabilities of the Soviet economy, that this perhaps illiberal regime could indeed overtake the West. Well, we forget that was part of the debate back at the time. If I could turn to you, Joshua, where was this coming from, and where was it grounded?
Well, if we talk about the 50s and 60s, the Sputnik was a very seminal moment, but this followed on a decades earlier, in which there was a very widespread conviction in the West that the Soviet model was successful, that Russia had industrialized and built itself into an economic power at a speed that surpassed the development of the West, and this tendency to this illusion about the successfulness of communism continued on from, let's say, the 1930s on through to the very end. There's a big, thick book called the Statistical Abstract of the United States, and originally it had essentially information from the U.S. Census Bureau, all kinds of socioeconomic and demographic data about Americans. But at some point along the way, they began to also add data about the rest of the world that did not come from the Census Bureau, but came from the CIA. And you could read in the 1989 version of the Statistical Abstract of the United States that the per capita income, the per capita standard of living of East Germans was slightly higher than that of West Germans. And this was the official wisdom of our intelligence agencies and our government. So there was a very long term, and I don't know what year it was that Lincoln Stevens said, "I've seen the future and it worked," but that same sense that communism was something that worked lasted for more than half a century.
Well, as a matter of fact, I agree with that. I think the big year was the year of the Sputnik, and that had a big impact on the West, and it produced changes in American policy. For example, a beefing up of the education budget and so on. But the real story throughout those years is, first of all, the dishonesty of Soviet official statistics, which were completely out of touch with reality. And anyone who visited the Soviet Union knew it. For example, an old colleague of mine, the late Peter Rodman, who later became a distinguished State Department official, as a young student, he and three friends had hired an old Rolls Royce and gone round, driven it through to Russia. They started in St. Petersburg and they went to Moscow, and wearing top hats and generally behaving like undergraduates. But he said to me, anyone who's been outside central Moscow or central St. Petersburg and driven on their roads knows that this is not a superpower. Now, he said the standard of living in the ordinary Russian was appallingly low by any Western standards, and the infrastructure and equipment was extremely old-fashioned. Now, there's another point to be made. In addition to overestimating, accepting these official statistics, which the CIA did and others did, they ignored the degree to which this the Soviet budgeting was distorted in favor of military spending. I mean, the GNP was much lower than they said, but the percentage of it that went into military investment was very high. So in a very crucial area, they were competitive for a long time. But they were hanging on. And when Reagan, for example, launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, they came up against an insuperable problem, which was, if this were to happen, could we keep up? Probably not, almost certainly not. Will it happen? Well, they were advised by all their best advisors that Congress would never fund it, but they couldn't trust that. It just might go through. So they had to either match the spending or come to terms. And I think that is one of the reasons for the end of the Cold War. Now, the other story is, as Josh has already indicated, the willingness of the West, and particularly the left, to believe the false statistics of Soviet performance. And there's one quite amusing incident here. Just after Geneva, the Geneva summit, Ted Kennedy, the senator, went to Moscow, and he had a meeting with Gorbachev. And in that meeting, and later in a private dinner with Gorbachev's principal aide, he's urging the Russians to be tougher with Reagan in the future summits. They've got to be tougher. They've got to use the force, their power in the world, their economic strength and everything else to take Reagan on and not let him get the credit for a tough policy bringing them to their knees. And the guy, of course, he's talking to is nodding in agreement. But of course, he knew, and Gorbachev knew, there was no way that the Russians, Soviet Union, at that point, could compete with the Americans. I mean, it was a fantasy. But the American left, and not the far left, but the academic left too. If you look at at Samuelson's textbooks, if you look at what the Sovietologists like Suor in Biala was saying at Columbia, they all believed in the strength, economic strength and military power of the Soviet Union, and they laughed to scorn Reagan's idea that it could be outcompeted and brought down that way. He was right, but the consensus of opinion among all the respectable people in the West and the bien-pensants was that Russia was a power of equal weight with America. It wasn't true then, and of course, it's even less true now.
I'd like to touch on a point, though, that both of you make in your writings in different places about this period in the 60s, 70s where we see the rise of détente, that there is this seeming kind of lack of confidence in the West. Not just a kind of a belief in the false statistics, but a kind of a malaise in the West about its own capabilities. There's something from your book in particular, John, the President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister. But 1970 was 2 years, 1970 being sort of the parallel with the rise of détente, but 1970 was 2 years after the revolutionary Annus Mirabilis of 1968. It was a time when historical currents seemed to be smoothly bearing mankind in an undeniably progressive direction, unquote. Maybe even towards socialism.
Well, very much towards a future described as left-wing in some sense or another. It could be liberalism or socialism. Probably it would be progressive liberalism on the western side of the wall and on the eastern side of the wall, a kind of gradual socialism. And both these movements were moving towards a state-run society, one more liberal than the other, but fundamentally similar in industrial and economic-based terms. Now, that was what a lot of people felt. I think there is a wider problem here, which is to say that within the West there is a great deal of cultural masochism, and it's always a factor leading to self-doubt and to overestimating both the virtue and the ability of one's opponent. I think an interesting set of insights into this is provided by the Danish historian David Gress in his book, From Plato to NATO, not the best title in my view, but a very good book, and in which he traces the response of the West through 30 or 40 years to communism. And it is the West, particularly Western liberal opinion, is sympathetic until the Nazi-Soviet Pact. It's anti-fascist in this period. And then the Nazi-Soviet Pact appears, and between 1939 and 1941, there's a brief period of anti-totalitarianism in which we see both Nazism and communism as being fundamentally the same thing, with of course, important differences. And then you have a period of anti-fascism again, not unreasonably, given that after the invasion of Germany by Germany of Russia, there's a period in which the Soviet Union and the West are allies. And that continues until 1947-48, when the gradual takeover of Central and Eastern Europe by Soviet power leads to a second period of anti-totalitarianism. This is quite a long period. It lasts 20 years, basically from 47 to 1968. What happens in 1968? Well, the 60s revolution and the response to the Vietnam War. And at that point, Western liberal opinion develops the concept of imperialism, or revives it, I suppose, as something which is as bad as communism and which undermines the moral claims of the democratic West to be superior to the communists. And this continues to be a factor right through the 70s and the 80s. I mean, it's not the case that in 1980, Reagan and Thatcher and the Pope had a massive public support for their resistance. They were probably representing, for a part of that time, minority opinion. And the left was continually worried about nuclear winter, They were producing films like The Day After, in which essentially tries to weaken the defenses of the West. They strongly opposed, and millions came out onto the streets of Western Europe to prevent the installation of American missiles to match the Soviet SS-20s. This was a period of intense political warfare within the West, in which those who wanted to withstand communist power, and did so successfully, nonetheless had to overcome a lot of opposition. So you have to say that there is in Western society, in some sense to its credit, moral self-criticism, which to its discredit sometimes descends into an irrational moral masochism, which leads to mistaken policies.
This was also the period that gave us détente, kind of a relaxation, an accommodation, a kind of an attempt, some sort of a cohabitation. Some who would speak of the benefits of détente. They would point to the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Helsinki Accords that come out of this period. But Reagan called it a mistake. Josh, was détente a mistake?
Well, yes, sure it was. It was a mistake. It was a reflection of a great sense of American weakness and defeatism. If I can add a few data points to what we've just been talking about, really by 68 and then increasingly so in the next few years, the United States was in the worst possible position in Vietnam. On the one hand, we were losing in the war, and on the other hand, there was a growing global chorus of condemnation of what we're doing in Vietnam. At the same time, there was a kind of shift in the balance of the community of nations with the emergence of the third world, with increasing number of countries that were former colonies that ousted the UN from ousted the U.S. from its position of dominance in the UN. The turning point being, I think it was 1970, where the symbolic vote was to seat the People's Republic of China in China's UN seat and to replace the nationalist government on Taiwan. And there was actually shouting and dancing in the floor of the General Assembly, not so much out of devotion to Beijing, but out of a sense that the U.S. had been brought low. And from thereafter, the UN became an arena that was in most phases dominated by the non-aligned movement. But the non-aligned movement itself moved increasingly toward alignment. It was non-aligned, but it was more anti-Western and anti-US than it was anti-Soviet. And in the late 70s, at a non-aligned Congress that was held in Cuba, the non-aligned movement came close to adopting a Cuban proposed resolution to officially align the non-aligned movement with the Soviet camp. But this resolution was defeated, but it was defeated primarily through the efforts of Tito, who was, of course, also a communist, but one who had a healthy appreciation of the threats posed by by Soviet power. So we were in an era in which the kind of global discourse, including within the West, but also in the international arena, whatever that may be, was just shifting sharply against the U.S. and the Western camp, not in favor of the Soviet Union. I think the Soviet Union itself was passé. And after the suppression of Hungary in '56 and the revelations of the 20th Party Congress, and then after a smaller but nonetheless very widely lamented reprise of the Hungarian events in Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Soviet Union no longer held any allure, but there was a kind of indefatigable urge to find some other sort of utopian model that went next to China and then to very strongly to Vietnam and the apotheosis of Ho Chi Minh as a great statesman and patriot, and very much Castro and Che Guevara, and there was a kind of jumping from point to point in the globe to find some representative of the socialist model that would be worthy of hero worship, and always in contradistinction to the kind of contempt that was felt for the United States and bourgeois democracy.
That, if we could turn a little bit to the other sort of school of thought on these issues. We talked earlier about, and in the video interview, there was a group of people who understood the nature of the struggle, despite all of that confusion perhaps in another place and self-doubt or wonder at the Soviet model. There were a group of people that understood the nature of the Soviet Union, understood the nature of the threat, understood why it should be opposed. In your book, Heaven on Earth, Josh, you describe in some detail your own socialist leanings from your youth, actually going back generations, and your own socialist activism. And into young adulthood with involved with socialist movements, involved in the Democratic Party. But we have with us today one of the preeminent figures of neoconservatism. How do you get from there to where you are today?
Well, to be clear, I was a very, very devoted and true believing socialist, and I spent 5 years as the leader of a young socialist organization, but I was never a communist or in any way sympathetic to communism. I was a socialist in the European social democratic sense, but for me, the big revelation was at some point when I was still, I think in my university years, that I recognized that communism and capitalism were not equal evils. I was still against capitalism, but I through reading, really more than anything else, just through reading, I came to see that was 100 times worse, and it had an enormous death toll in its record, and I understood from then on that the fight against capitalism, which I still believed in, that is, I believed in the fight against it, was something of much less urgency than the fight against communism, which was a force that threatened everything decent and humane in the world.
How much was 1956 part of that?
Well, being here in Budapest, I would like to say 1956 was the centerpiece of it. That would be not really true, but I was very aware from. I was 9 at the time, but by the time I was in my teens, I had read about it, and 1956 was one of the crucial landmarks. It was as if we were hit on the head again and again and again with the horrors of this regime. So in the 20s, it was the Civil War and the famines and Lenin's terror, and then in the 30s it was the show trials and more famines, and then in the 40s it was the Stalin-Hitler pact, and then in the 50s it was 1956 in Hungary, and then in the 60s it was Czechoslovakia, and it's a fortunate thing we were hit on the head again and again, because otherwise I think there was a great inclination in the West to just forget, and that was a few years ago. We need to be forward-looking and not pay attention. But the Soviet regime was of such a brutal and bestial nature that it would continually do these things that would serve as reminders in the West to what kind of animal we were dealing with.
Well, 56 in my case was an absolutely crucial moment. It had been prepared for in some ways. First of all, remember, I was born in 42, so I was a patriotic young boy from sort of 1950 onwards, because we'd won the Second World War. That was a big part of the way we thought about the world. So we felt proud. The second thing was I was a Catholic. And unlike a lot of other people, I paid attention to the Mincenti trial. Paid attention is too strong. I knew about the Mincenti trial, and it was obviously corrupt, wicked, wrong, and every possible thing you could say about it. So I was, when that happened, I was pretty young, about 8, I think. But it was there. So when 56 came, 2 things happened. Suez, so my patriotism made me rally to Eden, and what was happening here, it made a huge impact. I remember actually weeping when I was listening to the BBC broadcast Imre Nagy's appeal, and I felt ashamed that we weren't going to do anything about this, which I somehow knew, by the way. I don't quite know how I knew that, but I did. So I was an anti-communist before I was a conservative, really. And 56 was a kind of solidifying moment, the moment when a lot of other things come together with a kind of a click, and you realize you believe A and B and C and D. One can trace influences on one's thought in that way all the time. And the final one I will mention is that I had been to America as a boy of 7 and spent 4 months there. So when in the post-56 period, I found myself meeting CND students and young people who were anti-American and slightly soft on the Soviets, I was completely amazed because they knew nothing about America, which I'd visited. And they were telling me things which were palpable nonsense. And so I sort of became gradually, I suppose, an English conservative with a particular concern about communism, an anti-communist first above all, and somebody who was friendly to the United States. So I was kind of a NATO an intellectual, if that's the right phrase, avant la lettre, you know, before I really understood all of these issues.
John, in your book, The President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister, you kind of address the subject head on in focusing on President Reagan, Saint Pope John Paul II, and Prime Minister Thatcher, who emerged, as you point out in the first chapter of the book, they sort of emerge out of this period of kind of, you put it, cultural masochism, this sort of Western lack of confidence. They come out of this period, and they seem to fundamentally understand the nature of the struggle. I suppose it's a little bit more easier to understand how John Paul II understood it because he was living through it. But Reagan and Thatcher, how did they come to the convictions that they had?
Well, I think there is, here we have to consider the influence not only of intellect and insight, but also of temperament. A lot of people believed that communism was an evil and a threat. But they also thought it was the wave of the future. And that was true of people on the right in England as well. They were despairing. They somehow thought socialism in England and communism in the rest of the world was going to move forward, and we had to accommodate to it. There's an interesting account by Bertrand de Juvenal, the French writer, who visits the 1947 Tory party conference, and he discovers that the leadership of the Conservative Party has accepted socialism. There are only two groups of people who dissent from this acceptance. One is the rank and file of the party in the hall, and the other is Winston Churchill. His combative instincts, his kind of personality, his energy, his adamantine certainties, they meant that Churchill was not only someone who saw the evil of communism, but also was prepared to say so clearly and to argue for strong policies against it. The same is true, I think, very clearly for Margaret Thatcher. I mean, she was very cautious until she became party leader, and indeed afterwards, as she had to kind of move the party in her direction. But she, from the very first moment she became leader, she contacted Robert Conquest, the distinguished Sovietologist. He wrote the first of the two speeches that caused her to be named the Iron Lady, and she never really wavered from that policy. Of course, she maneuvered, but that's what politicians have to do. But she was firmly anti-communist throughout. Now, Reagan is, I think, a very similar case. But Reagan's personality is different. He's a very hard man, Reagan. I mean, he's a tough son of a bitch, as he told Paul Nitze to tell, you know, when Nitze came back and said, well, you've rejected the deal I made with the Russians over arms control. What am I going to go back and tell them? He said, tell them you work for one tough son of a bitch. And that's who he was. But he didn't seem that way, because he was an agreeable, good-natured, affable fellow. But he was cold as ice when he needed to be. So we're talking about temperament as much as about intelligence and principle, and you have to have those qualities, the qualities of the lion as well as the fox, if you're going to succeed in these great historical battles.
Josh, would you comment on that? I'm still curious. The Reagan example sometimes it confounds me. He's a country boy from the Midwest.
Yeah, well, I think it's useful to create a little context. You know, we've used here in from the opening of the term neoconservative, but I trust John, you'll take no umbrage if I say John is really not a neoconservative, as you've just heard. He was a Tory since junior high school, and which simply means that, you know, he figured out things a lot quicker that took me and others a long way around to come to understand. But I think that Margaret Thatcher was also of the same ilk as John, a very early on Tory. But Reagan is, I think, much more of my ilk. That is, he was probably the original neoconservative. Reagan started out as a man of the left, and he was the leader of a labor union, the Screen Actors Guild, and he was known to be vaguely leftist, but he was also party to some of the battles that raged within the American labor movement between communists and anti-communists. American labor has a very interesting history in that at several crucial moments or periods, the most militant anti-communists in America were labor leaders, starting with the original head of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which is the umbrella group of labor unions, Samuel Gompers, and then reprised in the early Cold War decades by the man who became the head of the AFL-CIO, George Meany. But in between, there was a very concerted effort with a considerable degree of success in the 1930s for American communists to become labor organizers and to infiltrate into the labor unions and attempt to take them over, and in fact to succeed in taking over quite a number of them. And the communists never achieved a majority, and because the others were anti-communist, there were quite brutal fights that went on for control of the labor unions. And so people who were in the labor movement, who were not necessarily terribly ideological, not intellectuals, but who were, from what they knew or sort of instinctively not with the communists, became very hard-bitten anti-communists from their own personal experience of fighting over who was going to control their union. And the battles in some of the big industrial unions were a lot rougher than in the Screen Actors Guild, you will understand, where they only throw punches on movie sets. But still it was a battle, and Reagan was part of that battle, and I think that helped to shape his convictions, and eventually he moved further to the right.
And they owe a great deal of a debt of gratitude to movements that gave the intellectuals, the public intellectuals, the writers who are giving flesh to this thinking, to real substance to this thinking. And that'll give us a chance to turn to commentary and national review. And as a setup, let us watch the second piece of the video interview with Norman Podhoretz.
Well, who were they? Modesty forbids, but many of them, most of them, I think, were gathered around the magazine I then was edited, Commentary. We started out as a few band of brothers, all of us refugees from one sector or another of the left. And we found one another. I mean, there was no party, no headquarters, no meetings to thrash out policy. It was all individuals operating from their own experience, intellectual experience, independently, and it all came together mostly in those days in the pages of Commentary. Some were academics, like Richard Pipes. Some were foreigners, French, Alain Besançon, Jean, Ravel. How can I forget his name? That's what comes of being 85. Jean-Francois Ravel. And there were some few people in England. But for the most part, we were what they now call public intellectuals, and we reinforced one another. We learned from one another. Now, to begin with, there were some socialists, social democrats in the group who, for reasons of their own, were strongly against the New Left, and there was a kind of temporary de facto coalition between the neoconservatives who actually were becoming conservative, I mean moving toward the right, and these social democrats. Well, Reagan, as I never tire of pointing out to people, was in a way the first neoconservative. I mean, he was a Democrat until he was 51 years old. He was much more to the left than the hagiographers now admit. I think that that we, it's hard to say this without misleading. I think that what we did throughout the 70s certainly helped create a new climate of opinion in the world of ideas. And without that change in the climate of opinion, I don't think anybody with Reagan's views would have been electable. That doesn't mean, you know, we did not have many divisions, unlike the Pope, and we certainly didn't command votes. But in the world of ideas, we won the argument, and I think people on the left even felt it and knew it. It just, in collaboration with certain events that helped open people's eyes, like the seizure of the hostages in Iran and the invasion of Afghanistan, coming about 6 weeks apart, which even changed Jimmy Carter's view. He said he'd learned more about communism in 1 week than in his whole, I don't know where he'd been the rest of his life, but even he was struck. This was, I mean, Reagan's election as President of the United States, capable of making policy, was preceded by a victorious battle in the world of ideas.
So that lets us turn a little bit to commentary and national review. In your article, which appeared in commentary, Josh, the neoconservative cabal, you described the movement as that this was really, it really emerged out of a response to the Soviet challenge, that this neoconservative cabal sort of took place in the first place. Norman Podhoretz says in that interview that they kind of found each other, they came together. How do we get commentary in this group that made commentary so influential?
Well, you know, as I was noting before, John was a conservative, not a neoconservative, and there was National Review. I guess we'll turn to that in a moment. And National Review was anti-Soviet, anti-communist from before the beginning, with William F. Buckley, and who tried to recruit Whittaker Chambers as an original co-editor, but I think commentary had built up a great deal of prestige for its intellectual quality, and then I think it had a kind of special traction that it got in the 70s because it had a tradition as a liberal magazine, and it was saying something new, that is new in the liberal world, what was new was not really recognizing that communism was bad, but crying out against this turn in the West and in the global balance of power, with a sense that the communists might really win the Cold War, and that much of the Western public has, as John before and I in some other remarks said, had grown quite complacent about this prospect. After all, the ones who are winning didn't seem to be the kind of gray and dreary Soviets, but the sexy and exciting Vietnamese, Chinese, Cuban communists, and commentary then raised a cry of alarm about how insane it was for the West, Western intellectuals, to look upon the spread of communism in the world as something benign or even to be welcomed. And this really cut against the grain of the late Vietnam and post-Vietnam era, in which the dominant view among American and I think other Western intellectuals, journalists, teachers, what have you, was that the great example of what had gone wrong in the world was the war in Vietnam. And the war in Vietnam was not something started by communists, but rather something started by anti-communists. And that the communist takeover of Vietnam was somehow seen as a natural process, and the benighted attempt by the United States, driven by obsessive anti-communism, a kind of neurotic obsession about communism, had created all this terrible bloodshed, and would create it again. And if only we gave up this devotion to anti-communism, then the world would be a much happier place. In fact, a headline read in the New York Times the day or two after Pol Pot took power in Cambodia, and the headline read, for most Cambodians, a better time.
I remember that very well. First of all, I think I want to say that we shouldn't underestimate the element of personal contact and the way it brings people together in alliances and promotes ideas in this discussion. After all, social forces are important, but they operate through people. Now, I'm going to boast in a vulgar way. My wife's in the audience. She's always telling me I should do this. I played an important part in two meetings. One is it was I who introduced Robert Conquest to Margaret Thatcher. And the result of that was it stiffened her resolve on those questions to do with communism and the Soviet Union in the period from 1975 onwards. She would probably have wanted to go in that direction anyway. That was her, they were her views and instincts. But he gave her the arguments and the backing to say, no, you're right about this, Margaret, and they're wrong. And that kind of thing is important. Now, I agree with the distinctions between the two magazines that Josh has already made. They were both solidly, in the period we're talking about, both solidly anti-communist. Commentary was a specifically Jewish magazine, and National Review was generally seen as a Catholic magazine. Technically it wasn't, but it was generally seen that way. They therefore had different audiences, and their arguments about the evil of communism, though they overlapped 85%, nonetheless there was some slight differences as well, none of which I think led to any real problems between the conservatives and the neoconservatives. But they weren't on the same side initially at all, and when they took some time to get together. Now, I wrote for commentary before I wrote for National Review. I was asked to do so on the question of foreign aid along with Peter Bauer, and we wrote a couple of articles for commentary, as a result of which, when I went to America, I met Norman Podhoretz my second week. We became friends. I was then with the Heritage Foundation, and I said, you know, Norman and Midge, they're essentially they have the same views as you do on all of these questions. Why don't we get them here? And I arranged a meeting at which in the lunch, Norman Podhoretz, I was director of studies, Norman Podhoretz addressed an audience of people in Washington interested in the Middle East. And in the evening, Midge gave a lecture on feminism attended by a fairly large audience. As a result of which, the Heritage Foundation asked Midge to become a member of their board. And this led to, I think, quite a fruitful growing together of these two organizations. It meant, for example, that it smoothed the path for Midge and Norman and their friends and allies and neoconservatives generally to move in the direction I think they would have wanted to move in anyway, which was to support Ronald Reagan for the presidency in 1980 when it became clear that Daniel Patrick Moynihan was not going to make a bid on the Democratic side. So I like to think that I played an important part in the development of modern conservatism. And I'd like that on the record. Having said that, when we came to look at the impact of the two magazines, it's very interesting that I think commentary probably had a much bigger impact on West European public opinion and intellectual opinion than National Review. But I think we, in National Review, had a big impact in Eastern and Central and Eastern Europe. And when Bill Buckley and I and others came here as communism was imploding in 89 and 90, we were surprised by the number of dissidents who came up, introduced themselves, and thanked us for the way the magazine had defended their positions very strongly during the previous 25 years. I think that it took some time to establish National Review, as they say these days, as a brand in Western Europe, and maybe that still hasn't happened. But for the audiences of this part of the world, they knew we were on their side. They knew we were firmly and intelligently on their side, and they knew that we were immovably on their side, and all those things counted. I think the same was true over a period of time for commentary, but it was a different audience.
So we spent the last several minutes looking back. Before I open up the floor to other questions, I want to ask one more round of questions and put you on the spot a little bit and ask us to look at today and forward. So we move into the 21st century. It's 2014. The European Union, confronted by one of the greatest security threats that it's seen on its eastern border in decades, appears once again incapable of wielding any effectual power on the international stage. The United States, under the current administration, seems seriously disinclined to any serious engagement, and at best a great preference for multilateralism. Meanwhile, we have an outright Russian invasion of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, the acquisition of Crimea. We have others in the region, again, talking about the malaise and the lack of confidence of the West, praise for illiberal regimes. What does this legacy that we talk about from the neoconservatives or the conservatives from commentary, from National Review, have to offer us today? Josh.
Well, I think today, actually, the issues are rather easy to sort out. I think there's what was so insidious about the communist threat was that it, on the one hand, represented a great amount of military power in different forms, both the massive Soviet military machine, but also the various guerrilla groups all over the globe who were taking up arms on behalf of communism of one variety or another. But at the same time, it espoused an ideology that was profoundly seductive, as we've been discussing. And part of the work that was done by National Review and Commentary was on the ideological plane. We were raising a cry of alarm against the force of the threat of arms that we faced, but perhaps even the bigger part of the job we did was to try to combat this ideological threat. Now, as I see it, at this time, the West faces two threats. One that's really just crystallizing is the threat of kind of resurgent Russian aggressiveness under Putin, and we don't really have a good sense of how far he's prepared to go and what risks he's prepared to take. And then a second threat, which historically I still think is likely to prove a greater one, in the effort of radical Islam to dominate large parts of the Muslim world and to use that as a platform for an attack against the West. But neither Putin nor the radical Islamists present an ideological threat. There are active debates in the West about how to respond to these forces, but there is more or less no one being seduced by them, except here and there a miscellaneous youngster, a Muslim, or even a convert to Islam in the Western countries will go off to Iraq, but that's not not an ideological threat. They're regarded. They may kill some people. They may come back with a bomb and kill some of us, but they're not going to attract any significant number of followers in the West. So that whole job of waging the war of ideas is not really at hand. What is at hand is the question of how to respond to each of these, and I think that on that we have to hope that there's a new U.S. government in 2 years and 2 months, or 2 years, 2 months, and 12 days. There'll be a new U.S. government that we hope will have the desire to respond. I think we're living with a government that thinks that all threats to us are something we deserve because of bad deeds we've done in the past. But hopefully there'll be a government with a different attitude, and then we also need really to better assess the nature of the challenge that Putin is presenting. And with respect to the challenge from radical Islam, I think we neoconservatives have to overcome some of the blame and criticism directed toward us because of the war in Iraq, which is seen as something that we had a lot to do with conceiving and seen as a big failure. So we have to come up with some convincing explanation of what the stakes are and some strategy for dealing with them. I think it's a pretty safe bet that President Obama's response to the Islamic State is going to be unsuccessful. That is, you can't, very rarely can you win a war by going into it saying, well, we're prepared to fight a little bit and we hope we win, but if we can't, then that's unfortunate. And so I'm pretty sure that Obama's war against the Islamic State is not going to succeed. A new U.S. administration will come in, I think probably with the threat being bigger than it is now. And we have a challenge of trying to formulate some compelling strategy for responding to it.
Well, I agree more or less completely with what Josh has said, and we'll just add a few footnotes. The first is that I think on the practical level, for the moment, dealing with the most urgent crisis, which I think for Europe and America is Ukraine, not Syria, then I would like to see a much greater concentration upon rebuilding NATO, both in terms of finance and equipment and material, but also in terms of the support it gets. I would therefore, for example, want to forget any element, this will get me into trouble with Maria Schmidt, I would like to forget any element of a separate European defense identity or policy. I think NATO is Europe's defense organization. What we need to do is to build it up again, to get the Europeans to pay a serious amount of money into their own defense and not rely on the Americans, and also to get the Americans back here, because this administration, the Obama administration, made plain in 2009 that it really wasn't that interested in what went on in Europe and was going to move elsewhere. Well, the crisis we now have is the result of that decision, and it's a very bad one. That has to be reversed. NATO has to be re-emphasized again. Secondly, I think I would agree with what Josh said about the Iraq War. Would he agree? I think he would. That the Iraq War, in some respects, is like the Vietnam War in the mid-70s. And in that case, we were saved by the overreaching of the Soviet Union, which suddenly made everyone aware that Carter's policy was a huge error, and there was a genuine and increasing threat, and that led to the election of Ronald Reagan. And I think Putin is overreaching myself here, and I think there is a good chance, certainly Mrs. Merkel's speech the other day suggests there is a good chance that we will rally around the flags. Now, all of this might be right, and it still would be inadequate if it weren't for the most important point. And that is the moral masochism that infects the West in general, which is generally expressed on the left, but not always. There are some people on the right who have said to the moral and cultural masochism. We have to recover self-confidence in our own societies, their institutions, and the animating ideas that underpin them. We managed to do this in the Cold War, not all the time. As I mentioned, there were the anti-fascist periods were really periods in which the left persuaded us that we were not very much different from our opponents. The anti-totalitarian periods were those periods in which we recognized that our societies were, by comparison with most other ones on this earth, virtuous and efficient. So we have to recover those things. I think the problem is that at the moment, the division between the people who've got moral self-confidence are the people, and the people who've got moral mass and cultural masochism are the elites. The elites are, in effect, they're not anti-national, they're simply depressive. And we've got to really animate the people to persuade the elite to readopt policies. I think that's what Viktor Orban meant by this speech, which I think was not well phrased and I think has been misinterpreted. But I think there is a need for governments to take pride in their own societies and their achievements and to work together to protect those societies against against unreasonable criticism at home and the attacks of people like Putin and ISIS abroad.
John and Josh will be hanging around for a few minutes after the event here, so you'll have a chance to speak to them individually. I want to remind you that the book is available. The Hungarian edition of Heaven on Earth is available for purchase in the back of the room, and I think Josh Moravchik would be happy to sign copies if you would like that. Please join me in thanking our two guests this evening.